Ivory-Bill could be the name of a ship captain at the heart of a romance novel, or a faded bill of lading listing workable dentine poached from pachyderms across India and the African continent. This morning, it refers to a magnificent bird, reportedly John James Audubon's favorite bird, the ivory-billed woodpecker. Based on a lifetime of avian study, Audubon's reverence alone for a bird might be reason enough for us to take notice. Bird watchers have long viewed seeing an ivory-bill as far more than a lifer, the term used for their first personal sighting of a species. Seeing an ivory-billed woodpecker was thought to be a life-changing event. In a few minutes, we'll play the Lord God Bird. The song takes its name from the exclamation most used when people saw the bird for the first time. Lord God, what a bird. In 2005, Sufjan Stevens composed the tune. The last confirmed sighting of an ivory-bill, the largest North American woodpecker, was some 60 years earlier in 1944. A few years ago, while waiting for a table at Townhouse Books, I purchased a book. Not unusual for me except for the subject matter, an expedition to find the ivory-bill woodpecker, thought to be either extinct or very near extinction. The Grail Bird was written by ornithologist Tim Gallagher from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York. Having gone to college nearby, I knew about the world-renowned facility housed at Cornell, but little else about birds. The book was a gift for my son. In the mid-90s, when he was 7 and his sister 4, my wife and I took them to visit one of my sisters living in Fort Lauderdale. Avoiding spring break beaches, we looked for things to do with children. We spent an afternoon at Butterfly World in Coconut Creek. My kids laughed hysterically when colorful translucent wings, like radicalized stained glass, fluttered and tickled their heads, their arms, their legs, and faces. To keep them entertained the following day, we planned a trip to visit the Everglades. My sister handed us an oversized book, The Birds of South Florida, when she saw us off in the morning. The children were close to silent in the back seat during our 90-minute drive south. Consumed by descriptions and colorful renderings, my son asked infrequent questions about pronunciation or the meaning of particular words. They both seemed awestruck. When we arrived at the low-key park and trail and boardwalk were much as I remembered from a previous trip. For millennia, fresh water from Lake Okeechobee, Florida's 730 square mile, 9-foot deep inland sea, overflowed annually. The overflow created a shallow, wide river covering all of South Florida, emptying into the Florida Bay north of the Keys, the Straits of Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico. Development of housing and industry eventually controlled the water, modifying the cycle. But the Everglades, those gnarly, humid mangrove swamps, remain. Slow-moving manatee still graze in brackish waters, the place where salt water from the ocean and fresh water from the lake meet and mix. Dinosaur-like in appearance, alligators are a major predator in the Everglades. To secure a home base and food source during the dry season, they leverage their formidable girth of their bodies to remove muck and carve out the underlying soft sandstone. These enormous earthen bowls are deep and wide enough to hold water. During the dry season, October through May, when Lake Okeechobee recedes and the shallow river dries up, all remaining wildlife congregates at these oases, called alligator holes. Insects are incessant. Turtles and snakes sun themselves. Fish dart through the shallows, desperate to flee ravenous birds, gliding relentlessly underwater. Like giant lizards, alligators lounge. But when they're hungry, they're lightning quick, Superman strong, and feast on the tasty morsels surrounding them. We left the book in the car and strolled the boardwalk, designed to move visitors safely through the swamp. My son pointed, identifying various birds: egret, cormorant, aninga, heron, ibis, woodstock, brown pelican. I was shocked he'd absorbed so much from the book during our drive. A large bird approached, unseen from behind, almost skimmed our heads, and grabbed a fish in its talons out of the water right in front of us. "Osprey," he called. We debated whether one bird was a purple gallinule or a peahen. Both kids were frustrated we didn't see a single roseate spoonbill. Needless to say, the book came back to Illinois with us. 2 years later, on an early spring trip to my wife's family cottage in Michigan, we saw a neighbor, a retired zoo director, documenting migrating birds for a national database. He offered to have my children come and help, and their cousins help. After removing a bird from a net, strung like a volleyball net between 2 trees near his cottage, he brought the birds to a table on his porch and diligently recorded the species, noted the weight, and tagged them with a tiny metal leg band. Then he gently passed them to the children. The kids took the birds to a small clearing and reluctantly sent them on their way. One was an indigo bunting, another a rose-breasted grosbeak. Children's interests come and go. Given all they are expected to know and do in the world, certain interests by necessity percolate below the surface. When I talked to my son by phone during his college years in Minnesota, he'd mentioned birding in a natural area near campus. His interest in birds seemed to be growing, maturing. My own experience and understanding of birds is very limited. His knowledge, now fairly extensive. We called him from Lake Michigan. It's plump and has long stick legs, a brown peach-colored head with black and white body, and a long, weird turned-up beak. "Sounds like an American avocet," he replied. I called when we clearly heard a hoot in our front yard, but couldn't see the bird in the dark. "Obviously, it's an owl. We're not sure which kind." He responded, "Does it sound like it's saying coo, like a muffled foghorn, or who cooks for you? Who cooks for you?" "That's it," I said. "Who cooks for you?" "Strix varia," he responded, "the barred owl." We verify in our bird book. "Thanks, cool," I say. So I bought the Grail bird to feed his interest. It sat waiting on top of a low bookcase, the cover staring up at me. I'd enjoyed reading a number of books by field biologists, George Schaller, Jane Goodall, and Farley Moat, so I read the Grail bird. Like a good mystery, there were shady characters, dead ends, questionable reporting, misleading accounts, and plenty of intrigue surrounding the Ivory-Bill's history and the quest to find it. Picus maximus rostra albo, literally the largest white-billed woodpecker, is reclusive and seems to have always been considered rare. Regal in the sense of majestic and impressive, the Ivory-Bill once reigned over the South's hardwood forests, from Texas to North Carolina, southern Illinois to Florida, and even further south into Cuba. Its plumage is primarily shiny black with purple tint. They have extensive white coloring on the ends of the inner primary feathers, as well as the whole of the outer secondary feathers. Thought to mate for life, the Ivory-Bill's estimated lifespan is 15 years. Nesting pairs are thought to need upwards of 4,000 square acres of old-growth bottomland hardwood forest to remain healthy. Their diet, primarily beetle larvae from dead trees. Believing the Ivory-Bill was extinct in the early 1920s, ornithologists were encouraged when a Florida nesting pair was discovered in 1924. Once their location became common knowledge, they were shot by local taxidermists for specimens. Reports that circulated of the Ivory-Bill's population decline drove people out of their way to hunt them for trophies and collections. Population reduction was a direct result of the loss of habitat. One of the last remaining natural areas, the Singer Tract, had been mostly cleared of hardwoods for the manufacture of the machine cabinets by the Singer Sewing Machine Company. But in 1943, the governors of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee, in a rare display of Southern state cooperation, sought to stave off the Ivory-Bill's extinction by establishing a new national park. The proposed park would have preserved approximately 800,000 acres of an ecological niche, originally many millions of acres strong. Singer had sold the logging rights for their portion of the forest to the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company in 1939. The governor's purchase offer for the property of $200,000, approximately $3.5 million today, fell on ears designed to hear one sound only, the ring of a cash register. Figuring they could make more money harvesting the timber, they declined the offer. The Chicago Mill chairman reportedly said, "We are just money grubbers. We are not concerned as you folks with ethical considerations." The sewing machine company representative said Singer didn't care. Ironically, the remaining stand of trees was then clear-cut to stumps by German POWs. An encounter with an Ivory-Bill by an Audubon artist in 1944 on the Singer Tract in northeast Louisiana became the last recognized sighting. With no credible sightings afterwards, on March 11, 1967, the Ivory-Bill woodpecker slipped onto the list of endangered species. All reports, even wild claims of seeing the bird, declined. The sighting by ornithologist Tim Gallagher and a colleague, fleeting as it was in February 2004, 60 years after the last encounter, led to the largest search ever mounted to find a rare bird. Researchers fanned out across the bayou. There's a telling quote in Gallagher's book, The Grail Bird, about his sighting. "You never know when you get up in the morning what earth-shaking event might take place and change your life forever." When I finished the book, I recommended it to my wife, a fiction-loving primary school teacher. "This is good. It's about an expedition to find a reclusive, possibly extinct bird." Unimpressed with my enthusiastic synopsis, she said, "Where do they search?" "The swamps and bayous of the Mississippi Delta." "That's not helping to convince me." "How far into the book do I have to read before they find it?" "Oh, they don't." "So it's a book about not finding a bird?" "It's really interesting," I said. I guess I could have been more descriptive. I'm not sure it would have helped. She took the book without looking. "Okay, I'll get to it at some point." Shortly afterwards, she read it and agreed with me. No longer pristine, I passed the book to my son. He gobbled it up. We all came away with a sense of optimism, with hope that this glorious creature, unlike the once prolific passenger pigeon, Carolina parakeet, and the great auk, all now extinct North American birds, had evaded the seemingly unquenchable appetites of our species. On September 29, 2021, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service removed the Ivory-Bill from the endangered species list, declaring the iconic woodpecker extinct. After spending most of my life in blissful ignorance of this bird's existence, and obviously never having seen one, I felt shocked and completely disheartened. My sense of loss seemed out of logical proportion, like a deep cut. Resigned from my annual winter message to family and friends, I painted a pileated woodpecker as a way of celebrating what we still have, a surviving, smaller relative. There was anger and debate amongst elite ornithologists about any benefit to the FWS decision. Some claimed it would lead to less protection, more rapid degradation and destruction of any remaining Ivory-Bill habitat. In that manner, the status change would impact other species as well. Extinctions are not a new phenomenon and not always caused by people. Scientists estimate a loss of 99.9% of all species that have existed on Earth, citing 5 cataclysmic events for the bulk of those losses. 70% of biologists surveyed think we are currently in the throes of a 6th mass extinction. Scientists estimate the number of birds in the US and Canada has declined by 3 billion, or close to 30% since 1970. Steep losses are apparent among traditionally abundant birds such as sparrows and robins. The warbler population has slipped by over 600 million, blackbirds by 450 million. I was upset and frustrated, and on another level, just sad. We remember and move on, right? After all, my life hadn't stopped. But as time, with a capital T, relentlessly propels me closer to extinction, the fate of others in similar circumstances is palpable, painfully difficult to bear. I felt the Ivory-Bill's finality being wiped from the list of the living, personally. I stopped researching birds and began looking at the Grail myth in hopes of discovering something which might prove uplifting. Dubbed the Grail bird, the Ivory-Bill's nickname seemed justified from the bits I remembered reading about nightly quest for the elusive Grail. I love when disparate storylines come together. Can I have a show of hands if you are familiar with the scholarly research of the English Grail collective known as Monty Python? Good. Well, in search for meaning behind the Grail myth, the knights who say "nee" were no help to me. Sources referred me to a book I read in my 20s, He, Understanding Masculine Psychology, by Jungian analyst Robert Johnson. Johnson interprets the Grail myth, and one of the knights seeking it in particular, as the male and masculine aspect of female nature coming-of-age story. An innocent rube, Parsifal, his name is literally pure fool, becomes a knight in King Arthur's court. During his quest, he stumbles into the magical Grail castle where the Fisher King resides. The king has a painful wound that, by extension, has negatively impacted the well-being of his court and kingdom. Parsifal had been instructed by an older knight to ask a particular question: whom does the Grail serve if he should ever meet the Fisher King? He's young, disregards the sage advice, and adheres to his family's admonition: don't ask too many questions. The next morning, the king and the castle have vanished. Parsifal returns to the arduous task of fending off bad guys and saving those in distress. In psychological terms, the ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. During youth, unbridled ego rules the self. It takes Parsifal a full 20 years of righteous living before he finds himself in the Grail castle once again. Humbled now by earnest experience in the world, he heeds the knight's advice. Mature, he doesn't squander his second chance and poses the question: whom does the Grail serve? The Fisher King's wound is immediately healed, the kingdom rejoices and begins to flourish. Parsifal's first meeting with the Fisher King occurs when he is only partway through his masculine development. He encounters something too big, too hot to handle. Recognizing his failure afterward, he's unable to overcome his growing awareness of himself, nor forget about it completely. Parsifal must continue the hard work of becoming a man knight until psychological integration, that is, self-awareness, contentment, passion, and authenticity, is achieved. To me, that seemed surprisingly relevant concerning the Ivory-Bill. 18 months passed. On April 13th, 2022, I forwarded an article to my son about an asteroid originating outside our galaxy. He responded moments later with a text. Ivory-billed woodpecker was just seen, not extinct, and photographed, apparently. I could feel the excitement in his text. An article followed. Multiple lines of evidence indicate survival of the ivory-billed woodpecker in Louisiana. I felt encouraged, joyful, a sense of relief, and admit I still do. Is there a place for the ivory-billed woodpecker in our world, or is this just a momentary respite until more habitat falls under the axe? Will we finally realize what could so easily be lost again and make an effort to ensure it doesn't happen? The answer to Parsifal's question, whom does the Grail serve, is simple. You, my lord, the Grail King. With this understanding, the paradigm of male adolescence is reversed, and the ego must now serve the self. The underlying lesson for maturity, we must serve something greater than our individual selves. Homo sapiens in our current form dates back about 300,000 years, and depending on your source, estimates for ongoing viability of our species ranges greatly. Perhaps on both a practical and symbolic level, this is humanity's Parsifal moment, our second chance. It's the opportunity to reverse the toxic, profit-based, immature flexing of Singer and the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company. We can answer the question of service with stewardship, asserting loudly and clearly, we will serve something greater than ourselves. If we choose service to the environment that includes the Lord God bird, it may ultimately save us as well. Thank you for listening.
Visit us at UUSG.org.